House prices are up nearly 30% in the last 12 months. All the predictions of the doom and gloom of the pandemic has not come to pass. Instead, what we have seen is immigration is zero, house building is at record highs, and house prices are at record highs. All the rules of the game are not working. But not only are we seeing that house prices are at extremely unaffordable levels, what we are seeing, of course, is that this very high house prices are now spreading across the country. 10 years ago, we saw most of the problems being very concentrated in our urban areas, and now that cancer is spreading right across the country. Recently, I was on TV1 talking about Aotearoa, only because I think it's a really nice case study. On the left-hand side, you can see house prices. The median house prices in Aotearoa is now nearly $900,000, which is an extraordinary number. For those of you who know Wellington, Aotearoa used to be seen as very much the poor cousin. And that is where people who are able to sort of commute to work, our builders and our carpenters and our plumbers, there were opportunities for people who are working class to be able to live in those kinds of places. Now, not just for people to buy, but also for people to rent, which is a very important part of the housing continuum. But over the course of the last few years, what we have seen is housing costs have just gone through the roof. Back in the early 2010s, house rents were about 30% of income. Now we're looking at about 45% of income, creating huge amount of stress in places like that and creating huge amounts of gentrification. What we have seen is very, very similar to what we're seeing in many parts of New Zealand. As you know, that for a lot of the provinces in New Zealand, the big story was around population decline, how people didn't want to live in those places. Now, Aotearoa was a bit like that, actually. It was exporting people for a long time. You can see that on those blue bars until about the mid-2010s, but about 7 years ago, we saw essentially we were exporting people because people didn't want to live in Aotearoa. But as the Wellington grew really fast and Wellington became unaffordable, we exported our people to places like Aotearoa. And that was fine because Aotearoa was affordable. But what happened was we couldn't keep up with the demand increase. You can see on the right-hand side that before the 2010s, we didn't actually need to build a lot of houses. The market was in pretty good balance. But since then, demand has just skyrocketed and supply has lagged. And when supply lags like this, it creates these sort of backwash of people that are really left behind. And what it really sort of boils down to is when we build lots of houses and when we have lots of population growth, most of the new housing supply is for owner-occupiers. It is housing that is for the top half of New Zealand. It is not for the bottom half. What we can see with places like Aotearoa is that, yes, there's a whole bunch of people who own their own homes, and they're by and large okay. But the number of independent renters is actually very, very small. In places like Aotearoa, close to 80% of non-homeowners get some sort of housing support, whether it's emergency housing, whether it's income-related rent subsidies, the TAS or the AS, right? These are big numbers. And what we're doing in places like Aotearoa is every year we're spending $75 million just to keep people in awful housing conditions. This is not going towards actually improving things. We're starting to see some policies heading in that direction, but I think the improvements are going to take time, and we all need to put our shoulders to the wheel to be able to move this forward. And I don't want to sort of take away a lot of the progress that we've made in public policy in the last decade. I know Phil Twyford gets thrown under the bus for all the failures in KiwiBuild, but the reality is a lot of the policy changes that have happened around the NPSUD, what's happening with things like the IRMA reform, the funding for infrastructure, these are good things that are going to pay dividends. And what you can see on the left-hand side is we've got a record rate of house building going on in New Zealand right now. We haven't had this kind of house building in decades. And on the right-hand side, you can see we are finally starting to increase our stock of state houses, but the numbers are still very low. We still have fewer state houses than we did in the peak in 1991. And in that chart, you can see the political, the to and fro. The right-leaning governments don't like public housing, the left-leaning governments like it. But in reality, it doesn't matter whether you're left or right. There will always be a group of people in New Zealand who are going to need support. When we look at across New Zealand, essentially what you see is about 70% of renters in New Zealand need some sort of support. Around 400,000 people, 400,000 households need help to be able to get shelter. The frustration that I share is not only are we spending $75 million a year in places like Aotearoa across New Zealand, we're probably spending somewhere between $3.5 and $4 billion a year on housing assistance. And that is a huge amount of money. That is only that OPEX. There is so little investment, so little CAPEX. That $3.5 billion, if we used it like a mortgage, we could spend 30, 40, $50 billion in capitalized terms. So we got to change our thinking and talk not just about the operating expenditure, but about the investments that we can make to be able to solve some of the big problems that are out there. We've got over 23,000 households that are on the register. These are people who are qualified and vetted to need public housing. They're poor, they have high and complex needs, and they deserve and qualify for public housing, but we simply do not have enough public housing. The orange bars is the shortfall relative to the current waitlist. We know that government plans, even though they are the most ambitious we've had in many, many decades, they're still not going to be enough to be able to build houses for all those people who need it. And one of the things that we've been doing in places like community finance and the community housing providers is we are providing housing for people who need it, and it's not just about the government. But to be able to do that, we need to get more capital in to build more houses. The planned increase in Kaingoa stock is 10,000. We should be increasing the total housing stock by 24,000. And so there is a 14,000 shortfall. To do that, we've got to change the way that we think about things. At the moment, quite a lot of support for community housing comes from the income-related rent subsidies from government and from philanthropies. And I think the way that we think about philanthropies is a very stylized approach here. But on the very left-hand side, philanthropies have a lot of capital. It's the returns from the capital that we tend to put towards good works. And that's okay, but we could do much more if we allocated some of our capital, not just the returns, to that investment.
I'd just like to start by emphasising what Shamubeel's touched on in terms of this new phenomenon, which is not actually new at all. It's been around for centuries, this concept of impact investment, where people are prepared to use the force of finance for good. And really, to put it simply, what that means is applying finance for positive social and or environmental outcomes. And we're seeing a re-emergence of that in the New Zealand context through the sorts of work that's going on in a number of spheres. It really started off, to be honest, in the environmental space with products that are looking to deliver positive environmental impacts. And now we're seeing the bug extend into the community housing space. Now, for a lot of the people in the finance sector, they might not know even what a community housing provider is. So I think that's a useful thing to touch on, because across the country, there are about 100 of these organisations. Typically, they're charitable. About 20 of the 100 are tikanga Māori organisations who are wanting to deliver Māori outcomes in each unique context across the country. And the strength of the sector really lies in its diversity. There are a broad range of chips, from the Salvation Army through to new migrant settler organisations, to regional trusts, to national trusts. And really, I think some distinguishing features that make them the special contributor they are to the housing system really lies in their diversity and their ability to adapt to each context and to deliver the right supply-side solution based on the actual context and the unmet needs that are in each community. As Shamubeel has said to you, we have the ability, using New Zealand finance, particularly through KiwiSaver funds, to solve New Zealand problems with New Zealand money through the proven solutions delivered by the community housing sector. So I hand back to you.
Right now, KiwiSaver is $80 billion, but there's also another $40 billion in the NZ Super Fund. There's another $40 billion in ACC, and there's a whole lot of other, let's call it, large pools of money which are available to invest in, affordable and social housing. So you have to, and that money, by the way, will be astronomical in 10 years' time. KiwiSaver alone will be $200 billion. There will be another $200 billion of, let's call it, investment funds, other savings that people have in funds. And by the time you add on NZ Super and ACC, it'll be well in excess of $500 billion available for investment. So the question is, why hasn't any of that gone into affordable and social housing? Or why has so little gone into affordable and social housing, given that KiwiSaver has been around for 13 years now, and ACC for much longer, NZ Super for longer than that? Well, if you look at it from a fund manager's perspective, a KiwiSaver fund manager, it doesn't matter how much goodwill you have towards your fellow human beings. your fiduciary responsibility is to return the best returns, long-term returns for your members, for your investors. So you have to think about this with a investment return lens on it. Now, at Simplicity, we're a bit different. We also have a charity, so we have a charity lens on these things. But let's look at it from the point of view as where all the money is. How do you get an investment return out of this? And because if you can get a long-term investment return, the money will arrive. Well, Shamubeel showed you all of those charts about the slow decline of housing, and you would have thought that, gosh, investment managers would have said, hey, housing looks like a good idea. Why don't we put some money in there? As happens in Europe, if you go to Spain, Germany, England, and so on, quite often 10 to 20% of pension fund money will be in affordable and social housing. Or let's call it, build to rent housing. There'll be long-term owners of large amounts of rental housing at least. Well, have a think about even a couple of years ago, we could have invested in housing, or any KiwiSaver manager could invest in housing, and we would have reasonably expected that return to be 4 to 5% in terms of what we call a net rental yield. The problem is that you would get 4 to 5% in government bonds. Housing has always been so attractive an asset class that the prices have always been high relative to other investments because it's been a tax-free capital gain. So quite frankly, the money hasn't gone in because it's just not attractive in terms of an investment return. And also there was the huge risk of what quality of housing were you buying? Were you buying leaky homes? This thing you'd have to own for 30, 40, 50 years, shares I can sell tomorrow. So why would things be any different now? Why would asset managers like ourselves look at this sector and say this is actually starting to look pretty interesting? Well, it's because of the very reason that house prices have gone up, and that's because interest rates have gone down so much. So because mortgage rates have gone down, for those who can afford the deposit, and I know there's an awful lot of people who can't, but for those who can, mortgages have made paying off that expensive house actually more affordable. So we're in this ironic situation where mortgage servicing has never been so cheap once you get the deposit in, but house prices have never been so expensive. So if you look at that from an asset manager's point of view, you say, okay, in a world where interest rates are now 1%, if I can get 3%, not 4%, if I can even get 3% long-term return, that starts to become very interesting. And the other reason it becomes very interesting is because in any market downturn there are two things that people always have to have. They've always got to pay their rental mortgage and they've got to buy food. Well, and arguably they need electricity and water and all that. But the basics in life are the bills that you will always pay first. So from an asset manager's and investor's point of view, if we own a large amount of long-term rental housing, we also know that in market downturns, that's the last bill that won't get paid. It actually makes it an even more attractive investment in market downturns. So I think what you're going to see from a KiwiSaver manager's point of view and an investment manager's point of view generally is quite a sea change towards this asset class and people starting to take it very seriously from an investment point of view because it just makes sense to put money into it now. It didn't make sense beforehand. It does now. But there's one huge issue for suppliers of capital like ourselves in terms of getting into this, and that is supply. The ability to actually purchase houses or to build houses. Because here is the issue. Housing from an investment point of view, housing is like any other commodity. It's like iron ore, it's like grain, it's like orange juice, anything that you will buy and sell in financial markets, and you can buy and sell houses in financial markets. The big issue is not demand. Demand changes over the short term, it goes up and down. Now, we've seen some structural demand changes in New Zealand as our population has increased. The big issue with any price and any commodity is supply. We have to have large-scale supply of housing in New Zealand. And the problem with KiwiSaver managers like ourselves is that if we buy supply on the open market, at the moment, there are very, very few people who can supply large amounts of affordable housing to us to own for a very long time. So you actually get driven down the path. And by the way, those people who do that tend to charge a very high development margin. They tend to want to sell on the open market, not contract to us for a long term at a fixed price. It's very hard to get supply. So the trick now is, as Shamubeel's pointed out, with all of this money, the trick is not supply of money. That is not the issue. There is heaps of money in New Zealand now for this asset class. The issue is, can you provide supply to the people who are writing out the big checks, the KiwiSaver managers and the ACC and NZ Super. And that's the problem with so many housing projects we see. We love them, we love the idea, but from an investment point of view, it doesn't move the needle, because we don't want to buy 10, 20 or 30 houses. We want to buy 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 homes and then rent them out. Because at that point, it becomes an asset class where you can get income, a reliable income coming in. And it is possible. So the work we have been doing over the 18 months, we've been having a very serious look at this sector. We've now concluded that it is actually possible to vertically control the build and supply of houses. So basically you end up owning the construction company and you fund it yourself, and then you can supply large volumes of rental and arguably some for sale as well, housing into the market. But it's just going to take time. It takes time to build that capacity and deliver it. But as Shamubeel said, the preconditions for success are here. The demand is very clearly there. And as Shamubeel said, the demand will not be satisfied under current market mechanisms. The money is now there via KiwiSaver, and it's just going to grow. It's a rising tide of money. We'll just grow, grow and grow. The issue now is the capacity, the supply. Now, on the supply side, by the way, and this is just my personal opinion, it is not land. New Zealand is one of the most sparsely populated countries in the world. There is heaps of land. There's even heaps of land in Auckland. Look at Aotearoa is sitting on 25,000 houses in Auckland, most of whom are situated in gardens. It's very old stock that can be densified. The capital is now available to do that. You just have to be able to do that capacity. So the issue with supply is not land. The issue is just construction capacity. And I think that we will get to a solution there. And I think we'll get to a large-scale solution funded by KiwiSaver money over time. It won't happen tomorrow, but I'm very optimistic that it will happen.